Something that I thought viewers might find interesting, since all of us can probably relate to this, is my experience and my views and my background with work. I've worked quite a few jobs in my life of quite different sorts, and so I thought it could be interesting to talk a little bit about that. And as I started thinking about this, there were a few things that came to mind, some general things. One is that, a lot of people have jobs that they don't find particularly fulfilling, and they're unable to find themselves in their work, or what they walk away with at the end of the day. They feel drained. They don't walk away with a sense of satisfaction. They feel, as we call it, alienated. And I've worked quite a few jobs like that in the course of my life. I'm fortunate that, I've arrived at a point where I have pretty fulfilling work, but it's not always been the case. Another thing that I recalled, and I originally wanted to attribute this to Henry Miller, but as it turns out, after checking it on the webs, it's actually a quote by William Faulkner. He says, "One of the saddest things is that the only thing a man can do for 8 hours a day, day after day, is work. You can't eat 8 hours a day, nor drink for 8 hours a day, nor make love for 8 hours. All you can do for 8 hours is work, which is why man makes himself and everybody else so miserable and unhappy." And that's kind of an interesting sentiment. I think there's a truth to it, that you can't day in, day out simply engage in pleasurable activities that don't produce anything, that don't change anything. Nor can you just eat or drink or anything like that. I suppose you could sleep 16 hours a day the way cats do, but that wouldn't be much of a life. So one reason why we have to work is because it helps keep us on track, but it's very important not only to just do a job if you want to be happy, but to find something that you can locate yourself within, that is meaningful to you. And when I started thinking about work, and I started thinking about the first jobs that I had, I kept on having to go back further and further and further and further and further. Because, quite frankly, I don't remember a time where we weren't doing something. And it wasn't necessarily remunerative work, even in the sense of getting an allowance, let alone getting a paycheck. But when I was a kid, everybody had chores. Not only did we have chores, but everybody on our block had chores. And there was always something that needed doing. We had an acre yard with not only a lot of grass, but a lot of landscaping and a lot of things that needed to be done. We had probably about 1/8 of an acre of that was garden, and then there was all the housework. And I remember as a kid, my dad was a very hard worker. He was actually a tax attorney. His father before him had been an extremely hard worker as well. Had a very short education as a kid, and immediately went to work, and eventually became for a short time a prize fighter, and got out of that as soon as he started getting knocked out, and changed his name and went to work for various companies, and eventually became a main consultant to the Glidden Corporation. And he would go and set up plants in Europe. And he wanted for my dad something different, something where you didn't have to scrabble quite so hard. But my dad ended up becoming this tax attorney who, that meant he got a law degree and he had a CPA. And I remember he worked very, very hard. Particularly during tax season, we wouldn't see him for more than a few glimpses for about 4 months, because he would drive the hour commute to work and drive back, and he was arriving at home later than we were going to sleep, and he was leaving earlier in the morning than we were waking up. And if he was around on the weekends, usually he had brought some work home with him. And his work is what made our entire lifestyle possible. At the same time, I remember him spending an awful lot of time with us, so it's interesting to think back about this. There's kind of a cutoff point, because he died when I was 11, and I'll do another video about that sometime. My mom had held different jobs, and actually she did continue to work part-time for instance, doing sales at Penny's and things like that. But for the most part, she worked in the home, and in her case, being a housewife was a real job. I mean, for one thing, while my dad was still alive, she cooked just amazing meals with quality ingredients, everything cooked from scratch, because that was just the way you did it. They had grown up essentially, lower middle class, and made it into the middle class, and were even, upwardly mobile into the upper middle class. And they carried forth this intense, you make use of everything. You work and do things all the time. You don't let time go to waste. And then, when you have time to enjoy yourself, you've cleared everything away, now you can just enjoy yourself. And so there was always something to do. And I remember, as being very little and already doing vacuuming and helping out with cleaning windows, doing weeding. That was a big thing. There was always weeds to be pulled. Working in the garden. August and September meant canning, processing the food for the winter that was to come. And so I remember myself and my sister, who was about 2.5 years younger than me, always having something to do. Sweeping, vacuuming, like I said, mopping the floors. Eventually my mom taught us how to do our own laundry, which was very good. That came much later. And then, of course, when my dad died, things changed, and my mom eventually had to go back to work, and she started out working in an office supply store that one of the neighbors had in Waukesha. We weren't living in Waukesha at the time, and eventually she found work as a secretary and worked her way up through the ranks and became pretty important, what we would nowadays call a personal assistant. So I had some really good models for myself, and everybody in my larger family, if they weren't working, it was because they were retired, and even when they were retired, they constantly found things to do. I spent a lot of time out in the summers with my grandparents and great aunt and uncle, and all of them worked all the time. There were always things to do, working on the tractor, tilling an even larger garden, taking care of the garden, weeding. My great uncle kept bees, and we would have to do a lot of different things with that. And there was never this sense that work was something, terrible or to be avoided. It was, look, there's this cool thing to do over here, and this cool thing to do over here, and this to do here. And it would cut into your playtime, but it wasn't onerous in any sort of sense. I would say that my first real paid job started when I was about maybe 12 or 13, so not that long after my dad died. And by then I was cutting the grass, and I'd been cutting the grass and also clearing the snow, with the tractor. It must be going back to like when I was 9 or 10, I would guess. And anyway, I would cut the grass, and after a while, my mom actually started paying me to cut the grass. And back then, for cutting the acre of grass, not quite an acre because there was a house on it and a garden and all that, I would get $2 or $3. And I remember, no, it was $2, that's right. Because I remember my neighbor, the next door neighbor who also had an acre, she came to me and she said, I'd like to hire you to cut our grass. I guess her girls weren't really into mowing grass, or her husband didn't like doing it, or she didn't like doing it. And there was this big scene because she asked me how much I wanted for doing it. And I was thinking, well, I get $2, so I'm going to really jack it up, and really go for the gold. I'll do it for $3. And she got angry at me. And she actually, I didn't realize this at the time, she wasn't angry at me per se. She was angry at what was going on, because she felt that my mom was kind of, ripping me off. And she said, you can't do it for $3. I will give you either $10 or $15, so you decide on what kind of a job you want to do for that. And I thought, wow, that's a ton of money. At the time, that actually was quite a bit. You could buy a pack of gum for 25 cents, gas was $1 a gallon, just to give you an idea. You know, this is back in the early 80s. So anyway, I started cutting grass for them, and you know, when it would snow particularly heavy, I and a few of the other boys would get together and go shovel people's drives and see if they'd give us some money for that. Sometimes they'd give us $5, sometimes they'd give us $10, sometimes they'd give us nothing other than a thanks, but that's what we did. And then my first, you know, job where I had a paycheck coming to me, not cash under the table, was working for the YWCA in Waukesha. And I think I must have seen a want ad in the newspaper. You know, we got the Waukesha Freeman at that time. And they were looking for people that they called teen peer educators. And so these were going to be kids who would go in and talk to other kids, younger kids, in schools about, you know, matters having to do with sexuality. And it was trying to promote abstinence. It was on this grant to try to do, you know, promote this idea that, well, you're better off, you know, there is contraception out there, but you're better off just being abstinent, and here's how peer pressure is going to come to bear on you. And I guess Waukesha had a lot of problems with teen pregnancy at the time, so they got this grant to do that. And it was kind of interesting because we got paid first to go to like several weeks worth of classes, and we got paid for that whole time. So I was like, well, this is great. I like being in class anyway. And you know, you got to meet kids from other schools. By then I was in high school. I was going into sophomore year of high school. So then what it consisted in through the year was going to these meetings, and I would ride my bike into Waukesha from Wales, taking the converted Drumlin Trail and bike to the Y, and then sometimes I would catch a ride home with my mom, who was working in Waukesha as well. So I was learning to be very reliant, to show up, to do what was needed, to transport myself, to, you know, make sure that I was on track with everything that my job required. And then during the school year, the Teen Peer Educator program meant that I would get paid to go into schools and talk with these kids and do the, you know, the song and dance that they wanted us to do, which I wasn't particularly into. You know, I thought that not telling them about contraception was probably not a great idea, but we were allowed to do that if the kids came up and asked us. So that was a decent job. It didn't pay an awful lot. It was minimum wage, actually. A lot of my jobs that I've worked for a while were minimum wage. And back then, minimum wage was like $3.35 an hour. Then my junior year, for a summer job, my mother knew this guy through the office supply store who had a janitorial service, and I went to work for him at nights. Didn't have a car at the time, so he would actually drop me off, or my mom would pick me up at places, and it was, you know, a lot of hard work. And it turned out that the guy was a crook. Later on, we found this out. He ended up firing me in part because I didn't move fast enough, and I thought I was moving pretty fast for this job that I had, but apparently it wasn't fast enough for him. And I remember with that job working in all these office buildings and getting transported from here and here, and mopping a lot of floors and vacuuming a lot, and always having these headphones on. And at that time, I was listening to a lot of classic Van Halen stuff and Rat. Anyway, I got fired from that. And then my next job down the line was working at a Walgreens, and I was still doing the Teen Peer Educator thing. The Walgreens job I ended up quitting and then getting fired from, ironically. And it was basically just stocking shelves and doing the cash register and that sort of business. And it was kind of cool because I got to meet a lot of people from other places. It wasn't like the janitorial thing where it was just this guy and his wife and whoever else he'd hired, and we'd show up to places. Instead, I was getting introduced to the world of you know, work, where people would like say, hey, what are you doing after work? And let's go over there. And people would get together. But you know, in my family, it was a big tradition that we would always get together for Christmas. And Christmas meant going down to Indiana where the big homestead was, the compound, you could say, where my grandparents had built their retirement home, and my great aunt and uncle, theirs right next door, and another great aunt and uncle next door, and so all my family would converge there. And they wouldn't give me off for Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, so I said, well, I'll give you a week then. And they said, forget it. If you're only going to be here for a week, your attitude's going to be bad, get out of here. So after Christmas, I came back, and by now we're looking at my senior year of high school, and I got a job at Kentucky Fried Chicken. At that time, it was in Waukesha, at the very, very east end of Waukesha, and Waukesha is a fairly sizable city. By now, we'd actually have moved to Waukesha, so it was about 2 miles walk from our house to this Kentucky Fried Chicken. And I would catch the bus. I would go after school. I would go down to the Y, and I would work out for a couple hours, take a shower, get dressed, get on the bus, take the bus out to KFC, close the place along with some of the other guys, and either I would get a ride from my mom, or I would get a ride from somebody else, or I would walk home. And I actually ended up walking home. You know, you don't think about this being dangerous at the time, but I walked on the interstate on I-94 to get home, because that was the only way to get there. At least that wouldn't take me really far out of my way. So I worked that for a while. I didn't really like that job that much because it was really messy. Grease was everywhere. I got to know some of the people who worked there, but there was a lot of drama. One of the managers actually robbed the till one day, and then got arrested, and I didn't really like it too much. I mean, I liked the chicken at the time, and I liked the fact that I got to bring stuff home after work. I had a ravenous appetite because I was working out quite a lot, and so that was kind of a perk. So then, after school ended, a friend of mine from high school, he was working at Ponderosa, and he'd been there for a while, and he said, why don't you come to work at Ponderosa? It's cooking, but it's not just like putting stuff into fryers and waiting around and marinating stuff. It's actual real grill cooking. So I said, well, okay, I'll do that. So got a job at Ponderosa again, minimum wage kind of job, and I did just about everything in the place except for wait tables, because I don't really like service that much. I washed dishes, I prepped, I was a grill cook, and you did filled out in a lot of different ways. And there was kind of a place where there were a lot of people who were just sort of on their way to other things, students. And then there were some people who were going to be there, the rest of their life, at least in the restaurant industry, doing one thing or another. And we would, have cookouts after work, and flirt with each other and drink and all that sort of stuff. Sometimes I'd go to bars, even though I was underage, because I looked old enough, with some of the guys from the place, or go to parties. And yeah, it wasn't bad. There was, quite a bit of drama here and there with this guy's girlfriend. Don't look at her, or that sort of nonsense. But for the most part, it wasn't bad. The managers weren't bad. It was fairly enjoyable, and it was it was interesting to get to see all these people. And so then after that, I went in the Army, and that was a whole different kind of experience. Maybe I'll do a video about that down the line sometime. I enjoyed I'll say this, I enjoyed certain aspects of the military a lot. I found other things just utterly insane, repugnant, irritating beyond belief. I think some of that had to do with the time and place that I was in. I was in a peacetime unit in the early 90s. And they really didn't have much of an idea of what to do with combat troops during peacetime. So a lot of the guys was just getting a lot of trouble, and I got in some trouble, but not a ton of trouble. I mean, not compared to what some of these other guys were getting into, but there was a lot of great things that I learned from the military, and I really enjoyed some of the friendships that I formed, and then there was some stuff that was just crazy BS. So anyway, I got out of the military a bit early. I got out during the budget cuts of 1990, the peace dividend, and it was kind of fortunate in a way, because Desert Shield started not too long after that, and my unit then actually did deploy to Iraq and sat around for 6 months before the shooting war started. And unfortunately, they'd gotten rid of a lot of the good NCOs during that peacetime dividend, cutting the troops kind of thing, and they kept a lot of the, what we called kiss butters, the people who were always pressing their uniform and shining their boots, but really didn't know their MOS very well. So I don't know, it might not have been so hot going off to war with the NCOs that they still had. Anyway, I got out, and I needed to find a job right away to bring in some money. My mom started charging me rent as soon as I finished high school, even though I was 17. And it was good because it taught me responsibility. It taught me to start budgeting and all that. So I got out, and I was living at home, and started looking in the want ads and going around to places, sending applications. And there was a Shakey's Pizza place right down the road, so I applied there, and right away got a job there. And that was same sort of restaurant thing, except now it was not grill cooking, but pizza cooking, and doing a lot of things for the buffet. I actually the first thing I started doing was prepping the buffet in the morning, and then I would bartend during the day. That was kind of fun, learning how to tap beer and, pour wine and, run the register. And then, after a while, I was pretty much doing everything in the restaurant. I learned how to do every single job in the restaurant, except for manage, and I wasn't very interested in that. They talked to me about that, but I didn't really feel like I wanted to do that. And after after being at Shakey's from March, I was there from March until August, and then I went to college. And while I was at Lakeland College, I did a work study. They hire students for these kind of pretty easy jobs, and some of them are kind of make work. The job that I had, it was for the art department. God only knows how they put me in there. And they had me doing two things at first. One was like, being a guide in the art gallery, which was kind of cool because I could like sit there and read because hardly anyone came in there. And then if anyone actually did and they were interested in art, I could talk about art with them. And I got to meet the artists who'd done the exhibits, so that I could speak intelligently about it. And then they had this just, honest to God, dirtbag guy who was a carpenter working for them, who later on opened up a porno shop downtown. This is in Sheboygan, during my college days. And he was a very seedy kind of guy, but he was a good carpenter. And so I would work with him in making various frames and things like that whenever they needed that, because I was good at carpentry. One of the things I didn't mention actually is I worked with my uncle, cash money jobs as a carpenter and painter for a short time as well. When I was like 16, I roomed with him. He was rooming in a place, this is a whole different state, and hung out with him. And it was kind of a good experience of life. He was fun uncle to hang out with. Anyway, going back to that, so I did that for a while, and then my second semester there, they had a position for an artist model. And so that's actually what I did. And the funny thing is, you think artist model, totally nude. Well, it wasn't totally nude, because it was a United Church of Christ school, which is about as far left as you can get in the Christian spectrum. But they still had like some things that they were kind of, uncomfortable about. Some things that they actually had some doctrine about. And one of them was you can't have nudes. There was a big thing about nudes in the art gallery at one time. So I modeled with a swimsuit on, a Speedo. At that time I was, in amazing shape. I was like 190 pounds, and, I'd worked out all the time and that sort of thing. And that was kind of fun. I didn't get paid that much. In part, you would have gotten paid more if it was fully nude, but and that was tough work. I mean, you think that being an artist model is easy. You got to take a pose and then you stay in that pose and you can't move. And if you do move, the artists start complaining and saying, "Keep your foot still," because they want to sketch you or paint you or something like that. And I actually ended up doing that throughout my college years. To make money here and there, sometimes for classes, sometimes for individual things. Somebody had a project and they needed somebody with my build and shape and all that sort of stuff. What else did I do? Oh yeah, I had a whole succession. There was a summer where it was a succession of jobs. I started out working in this factory called JL French, and they made aluminum die-cast parts. And I started out working on this machine called the Blaster. And that was back-breaking work, but it wasn't bad because I was in really good shape. They would often want you to work 10-hour, 12-hour, 14-hour shifts, but they would give you overtime. Pay wasn't very good. It was like $6.25 an hour. But for that kind of work, that's kind of hard work for that price. But it wasn't bad. The reason why I decided I didn't want to work there anymore is they started putting me on these other things, like the testing booths, which are all water, and there's like water sloshing all over you, and my feet would get really waterlogged and start to hurt by the end of the shift. And I thought, this isn't for me. Then they also had me like learning how to be the tape and band man, and they apprenticed me to this guy who was just like a meth head. I remember working another job. He would come in, and back then you could sell this ephedrine stuff over the counter. He was just totally addicted to it. He'd shake like this. Of course, not the best trainer, you can imagine. Totally all over the map. And so my girlfriend at the time, her father knew this guy who had a tree cutting service. So I quit the JL French job and I went to work for this tree cutting service. And at first it was pretty good, but then I realized I'd gone from bad to worse. This guy was absolutely insane. And it was cash money, but this guy was just repugnant. We would start out each day, and I would show up, like 7 in the morning or so, and he'd still be drinking his coffee and watching the TV shows and yelling at the TV, and then he'd get on some tirade, and it might be about the blacks, or it might be about the gays, or it might be about this, or it might be about that. And you got to realize, wow, this guy is just like some way far right wacko. And I'm not a liberal, but I have a fairly low tolerance for people's BS, particularly if it's just spouted BS and has no basis in reality other than the person's emotions. And so this guy was kind of irritating. I did like the fact that I was working with a wood chipper and chainsaws and stuff like that, and I enjoy that kind of physical work. But I couldn't stand this guy. And then the people he'd hire to work for him, boy, they were a bunch of characters. And none of them were as bad as him, but they were pretty crazy. So I worked for him for about 3 weeks too. And then finally one day, the wood chipper, I was at a job in Plymouth, and the wood chipper just got stuck and it wouldn't start up again. I said, the hell with this. It was kind of cool because I also learned to drive a dump truck too while I had that job. I learned to drive the truck that we hauled the stuff with. Drove the stuff back, left it there, got in my car and said, screw this guy. And my girlfriend was pretty ticked because she came from a family where you never are without a job. I was raised with, well, you always need to find a job, but it's not that you have to have a job before you find another job. Your job is not your whole life. It's how you make your money, and you want to be reliable. So the next job that I found was actually working at Walmart. And Walmart was quite a bit different back then. It wasn't these super Walmarts like you see nowadays with the produce and all that. And the job opening was for working in sporting goods and automotive. And I had to work there in part because at that time Walmart was gender divided, you could say. Women could work in certain areas and men could work in certain areas. Of course, women could work in any of the areas that men were working, but men couldn't work in those. So men couldn't work in jewelry, men couldn't work in women's apparel, and here was the most interesting thing. Men could not be cashiers. We could work behind the cash register if need be, and we were trained on that, but we couldn't be cashiers. So they put me in sporting goods and automotive, and in some respects it wasn't a great fit because I don't know anything about cars and I don't really care much about cars. And I'd have these gearheads who'd come in and we had all these products that we sold. And they'd ask me about, is this going to improve this and is this going to improve this? And at first I'd like try to reason it out with them, or I'd tell them, look, I don't know. And then after a while I realized it doesn't matter what I tell them. They're either going to buy the product or not. So I just, yeah, that's going to make your car run perfect. And the sporting goods stuff, I was pretty good at that. I understood, how those things worked, and we also sold a lot of guns and ammunition, which was kind of interesting. You couldn't sell a person a gun and ammunition and have them walk out with it at the same time. If they bought both of them, somebody would have to carry the ammunition out while they carried the gun out. But yeah, we did that, and so that was kind of interesting. But I didn't really like Walmart that much. I did a lot of stocking shelves too. The thing I really hated about it is I had to wear a tie all the friggin' time, and a shirt and a tie, and it was minimum wage, and so started looking for whatever I could find, and fortunately enough, by now it's my junior year in college, I became a security guard working for the college. And they just started this new security corps. Eventually I became the shift coordinator for the second shift. And I really liked the job. I had the run of the entire campus. I had keys to everything. Admittedly, I used some of the time and some of the keys for things that I shouldn't do, like, having breakfast early in the morning when I'd get hungry, but I was on the meal plan anyway, or, sneaking a girlfriend in here, things like that. Going into the music area to play my bass late at night, in a soundproofed area, But, for the most part, I did a pretty good job, and it was kind of fun, and I enjoyed it. Had some run-ins with some real jerk students. A lot of people made threats, these sort of Milwaukee gangbangers from time to time, but nothing ever came of that. In part because back then I was, still a little bit, still the military kind of attitude, and people didn't really bother me. So I did that all the way through the rest of my school, and then once that year was finished, I did that the next summer and did that the next year. Then, after graduating, I decided I wasn't going to go to graduate school right away, and I roomed with a friend in a little town just down the road called Franklin, and I got a job in Howard's Grove at a gas station, working behind the counter at the gas station, and basically, selling people gas and processing their credit cards. Back then, everything was done by hand. Turning the pumps on, to turn the pumps on by hand. Selling all sorts of, stuff. We sold beer and cigarettes and ephedrine and snacks of different sorts. We had a trailer park next door, and a lot of the underage kids in the trailer park could try to come over to buy cigarettes. That was kind of an issue, or they'd try to steal beer and all that. And that wasn't a bad job at first, but it came to be a bad job when they changed managers. Because I spent a lot of time, during the downtime, I was working the second shift. I would write letters, and I would, work on my French and work on my German and listen to music and stuff like that. And they had a video camera that would watch us all the time. So this new manager came in, and she said, no writing letters, no reading, no doing this, no doing that. And I said, so what are we supposed to do during the dead time? She said, you can dust shelves. And I said, well, you can stick it. No way I'm dusting shelves. So I did that, and then I needed to find another job, and my mom at that time was saying, look, there's nothing up there for you. You're done with college up there. There's all these dead-end jobs up there in the Sheboygan, Howard's Grove, that area. Come back down to the Milwaukee area, and let's see what we can do. So I moved my stuff down and stayed for about a week. My mom by then had moved to Menominee Falls, which is a suburb of Milwaukee, and I found an apartment downtown pretty quickly, and I went to a temp agency. That was my first time for doing that. So I went to a temp agency, and they hooked me up with a job out in Brookfield, which was at a mortgage company, and that one only lasted 3 weeks. The reason was because these mortgage companies were bundling together mortgages. This is back in the mid-90s. They were bundling together mortgages into these, anywhere from $1 million to $50 million packages, and selling them to investors. And the interest rates changed. I don't remember exactly, what the thing was, but whatever it was, it made their business model unfeasible, and the job was ended. The entire place closed down. And I remember thinking to myself, thank God, because as a clerk in a place like that, man, it was soulless. It was sort of a vision of what my life could be like if I didn't, get myself off that career track. So then I ended up in an apartment, a little rat trap apartment in downtown Milwaukee that I had to come up with $280 a month for, and no job. So I started immediately looking in the Milwaukee area, and I had a couple interviews. I started doing security stuff. One was a security job at Alverno, and that's an all-girls college, and once I started researching it, I found that security guards did not last long there, in part because of just all sorts of problems that they were having. And then the other one was in this massive office building, which is still downtown, called the 100 East Building. And I got a third shift job, and that was really cool, because I would go into this high-rise building. It has 34 floors, and it's pretty expensive real estate. And you could look out over the entire city. And that was one of the perks of the job, just getting to do this as I walked my rounds. I would walk 7 miles a night on the job, and I walked a mile and a half there and a mile and a half back, so I'd get in 10 miles of walking a day. I had plenty of time for reading, for working on my languages. I liked some of my coworkers, some of them I didn't like at all, and one I almost got in a fight with because he was kind of a jerk. But it wasn't a bad job, and I was able to squirrel away some money so I could travel before I went to graduate school. So that's all my pre-graduate school stuff. In graduate school, I didn't actually have to work an awful lot. I was a student, and I was fortunate enough to land myself into positions where people were actually giving me a stipend and paying for my tuition. So my first 3 years there, I was actually on a Morris Fellowship. This is at Southern Illinois University. And I think the main reason I got it is because I maxed one of the sections of the GRE. The graduate record exam. I maxed the analytics section. I got the full high score. So they thought that I had some promise. They gave me 3 years, and it consisted in paying for my tuition and giving me $1,000 a month. I still had to pay student fees, and I had to cover my own room and board, that sort of stuff. But it wasn't a bad existence. I lived in a trailer for a good portion of that time. But living in a trailer wasn't too bad. Maybe I'll tell some stories about that sometime as well. After that ran out, then I TA'd for a semester. And then after TAing for a semester, they said, hey, do you want to teach your own ethics class? So I started teaching ethics classes. That was the very first class that I ever taught. And after 2 semesters of doing that, they said, how would you like to step it up to a upper level class, a class called Philosophy of Politics, Law, and Justice? Perfect. That's exactly the sort of thing I wanted to do. So I taught it, and I wasn't a particularly good teacher at that time. I'll do a video about how my style has changed since then. It must have been hell for some of my students. But anyway, I did that, and then I started working on my dissertation, so I applied for and received a dissertation research award, which gave me another year of funding. And then I needed to find something, and I started out doing translation work in Latin, and then working for the Dewey Center. John Dewey is a major American philosopher who's studied pretty extensively at Southern Illinois. So I worked for them for a semester. And then after that, I got a job working for Southeastern Illinois College as an adjunct. I taught an intro, an ethics, and a world religions class. And that was my last semester in Carbondale. So my first semester, we'd moved to Indiana, and I just sent applications, cover letters and CVs to every place within a 2-hour or 2.5-hour radius. And I started getting some replies. I got an offer to teach 2 classes at Manchester College, which was located 2 hours away from where I lived, and I actually took it. I got an offer to teach a class for Purdue Calumet at a local school, a professional ethics class. And then about halfway in the summer, I got hired by Ball State to teach in their extended education prison program. That I've talked a little bit about that in some of my other videos. And that was a full-time job. That started out at $35,500 a year, which at that time was not bad starting pay for straight out of graduate school. I knew friends who were getting as low as $27,000, $28,000, which is not much to live on, especially if you have a family. So that first semester I taught 8 classes, 5 for Ball State, 1 for Purdue Calumet, 1 for Manchester College, and I was driving all across Indiana at the time. The prison was an hour from where I lived. The Manchester, which I went to 2 days a week, was 2 hours from where I lived, and I put on a lot of miles on the car, but it's what you got to do when you need the work. So the next semester after that, I dropped down to just teaching 4 classes a semester, and then for the next 5 years, I taught for Ball State in the prison program, and sometimes I would teach 6 classes, sometimes 5 classes, sometimes 4 classes per semester. And it was an interesting job. It was good. I did a lot of other things while I was doing that. I started working on my first book. I published a lot of articles. I went to a lot of conferences and presented. I applied for a lot of jobs and interviewed for a few jobs. For instance, at the University of Illinois at Chicago, Franciscan University Steubenville, St. Anselm's College, just a whole bunch of different places, and never actually got an offer. So then the prison program began to end, and I had to get on the job market quick in the fall, the late fall of 2007 and spring of 2008. And fortunately, I got a job for Fayetteville State University. I had one other offer at another place, but I took the job at Fayetteville State University, and that meant moving very far away from my family in Indiana, 14 hours away, and taking a job and being sort of almost like on military deployment. So I did that, and I was at Fayetteville State University for 3 years. Ended up, there's a whole different story about that, getting a divorce for all sorts of good reasons, and then reconnecting with the woman who I knew from high school, who I would eventually marry, my wife, who's very good. And I was down at Fayetteville State University for 3 years, and then I left to come up here to New York. And the reason I did that is because I got tired of having this long-distance relationship with my wife. And she was working up here and still is. So while I was at Fayetteville State University, I was an assistant professor in philosophy, mainly teaching critical thinking classes. I took every single opportunity that I had, anytime they had any sort of fellowship, stipend, extra job to do, I took it. In part because I needed the money, wages got frozen immediately after I got hired, so there wasn't any way to make any more money just by doing your job well. And in part because it gave me some really valuable job experience. I started a business ethics a program to educate business educators about how to teach ethics well. It's called the Ethics in Business Education Project. I learned about the collegiate learning assessment, and then through their academies, and then I became a real, policymaker, I helped write the quality enhancement plan for FSU, the things that had to do with critical thinking and the CLA. I ran institutional assessment using the CLA. We switched from the C-base, which was a multiple choice test, to the CLA, which is authentic assessment of critical thinking and writing abilities. I instituted that with the help of a lot of other people, and then ran it and reported on it. I got to write and then run a writing across the curriculum pilot project on close readings for faculty in the humanities. And so these are just a few of the things that I got to do. I did a few fellowships, one in service learning, one in information literacy. And then I also did publish my book and started doing public lectures here and there at libraries and doing workshops. So when I came up to Kingston, New York, which is where I live now with my wife, I had a lot of really useful job experience. I started looking around for where I could get work, and I started teaching classes for Marist College. You may have seen some of my Marist College lecture videos. That's maybe how you ended up seeing me on the web first. And then I continued shooting more and more videos here in our home office. We bought a chalkboard so I could start doing work right here without having to be in a classroom. I also do educational consulting. Colleges and universities bring me in to do workshops, to meet with faculty, to meet with administrators about things ranging from critical thinking to lecture capture to assessment of student learning to how to infuse ethics and critical thinking into classes and curricula, how to teach that sort of stuff well, how to assess it well. I have I'm connected with a lot of different projects. So that's what I do. If I had to say what is it that I do at this point in time, what is my work? I'm working part-time for Marist College, teaching in the classroom and teaching online for them. I shoot these videos that you're seeing. That consumes quite a bit of my time. I produce other online resources that students and lifelong learners use. And I still continue the work that a normal college professor would do, writing books, giving conference papers. But I also give a lot of popular lectures at libraries, at churches, for businesses, clubs, organizations, that sort of stuff. I've finally found my real vocation, which is to take philosophy, which is often quite abstruse and complex and has this whole historical background, and make it accessible for non-philosophers. I do like talking with philosophy people, but I enjoy seeing non-philosophers, non-professionals, non-academics even, seeing the light bulb go on in their head, seeing them understand something, and seeing that they can apply it, and that it's worthwhile for them, that it enhances their life. That's what I'm doing now. So I'm pretty fortunate to be able to do that. Really is my full-time job. Where I'm going to be 10 years from now, what kind of job I'll have then, I'm not really sure. I'm sort of plowing ahead with what I'm doing, the teaching, the writing, our consulting company, Reason.io, through which I give my talks and produce resources and all that sort of stuff. I can say this, I'm happier now than I have been in any of the other jobs that I've had up until this point. So I think my 40s are probably going to be my most productive and enjoyable working years.